There is a problem with this conceptualization, though, when you look at the data, because China, the bottom line is China wasn't heavily involved, at least directly, in mortgage-backed securities or collateral debt obligations. And actually, if you look at it, this is only with mortgage-backed securities. With the larger category of asset-backed securities, it's far less. Total foreign proportion is less than 28%. But amongst mortgage-backed securities, U.S. corporations and firms own directly 60% of it. Foreign was 40%. Of this 40%, 60% of it belonged to the EU, primarily England, Germany, and some others. But there is a trade deficit with China. What's my time?
5 minutes.
Okay. So there appears to be there's some people who write about the trade deficit, and basically there is an argument to be made there because it appears that capital is taking advantage of a wage differential rather than a comparative advantage, which is based on Ricardo's theory of if there's differences in opportunity costs, even the absolute the country or firm that's is better in absolute terms, like it's better in production, they would still benefit via specialization, but that doesn't include or take into consideration that a lot of this, like the Chinese firms, for instance, aren't more productive, they just have lower wages, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Here's another flow that Drew might talk about. My question after reading this global pool of money stuff is, well, who created the global pool of money? A lot of the stuff is circular and it's sort of arbitrary where you start out. But since the 70s, the distribution of value added in the U.S. and across the world has been skewed heavily towards capital at the expense of labor. And there's been a downward pressure on wages, not only from because of trade, but just in general. And they've had a stagnant median real wage since the 70s. And in order to maintain consumption, you basically give them a credit card or a loan rather than a pay raise. So this is another flow. Labor produces stuff. Stuff is sold. Surplus is pocketed as profits. It's reinvested in production and/or I should say or loaned back labor to sustain consumption. So that's another way to conceptualize the flow. And there's lots of different ways to conceptualize these flows. Then I'm going to talk about briefly these papers because they're really symptomatic and paradigmatic of the dominant paradigm of economic thinking. These just came out. The NBER paper, basically Casey Mulligan argues that it's different in terms of consumption. This recession is different from previous recessions because productivity has grown, but labor supply has dropped off. And Mulligan actually attributes this to work disincentives and actually makes the argument that people are not working because they don't have an incentive to work because of the bailout, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the next one actually made me laugh. We will have to cope with crises also in the future as they are normal adjustment processes in an innovative, utility-maximizing world. Denying this normal pattern means ignoring reality and missing opportunities. There are winners even in a crisis. Now, what are the limits to this kind of analysis, which is the mainstream neoclassical economic thinking? First, both studies ignore involuntary mass unemployment and regard it as impossible because of the efficiency postulate that markets are themselves head towards equilibrium and are efficient. Two, the assumption of equilibrium is falsified by reality. See Bunji 1993. Any idea of an asset bubble is incompatible with that theory. Three, the utility maximization is an undefined function that can be used to describe anything, but it's not useful for predictions. So, for instance, they don't define what utility maximization is or whose utility is being maximized. Profit maximization is just one measure, but profit maximization even at the firm level, even as a means of maximizing the utility of the firm, is in itself in conflict with other obligations or desiderata, such as increased market share, consumer satisfaction, employee loyalty, etc. It assumes utility maximization equates profit maximization, and they ignore the empirical studies show that investors are guided by irrational expectations. I'm almost done. I got 2 more slides. Okay, so last thing, 5. Posits methodological individualism. Agents as free actors, but implicitly assumes the economy as a system. What do I mean by this? It means that they assume in the study that everything is based on these atomized individual actors that are maximizing their utility, but they also implicitly assume at the same time the concept of a firm as an emergent entity which can maximize its own utility. Okay, so this is the principle of methodological individualism is contradicted by their own results and their own assumptions within the study itself. 6, both fail to identify causal mechanisms and therefore remain fundamentally descriptive rather than explanatory. For example, Mulligan uses something called decomposition analysis, which is something that I actually use in my time series papers. But these are descriptive, like most regression analyses. They're not explanatory. There's nothing wrong with that unless you claim that you're actually explaining something. To explain something, you need to, at least I'm going to propose, you need to identify a causal mechanism. So the way decomposition analysis works is you have the number 5, you decompose it to 2 and 3. And then claim that 2 and 3 are explanations or causes of the number 5. It's superficial at best. 7, markets are not closed systems. They're embedded in social relationships and also in environmental systems. 8, there's no single optimal way of surviving the market, i.e. that there's not a single equilibrium but multiple equilibria, and there's actually multiple ways of satisficing or surviving within the market. An example that I've been reading recently is this new book that just came out, which is an excellent piece of sociology, Bullish on Uncertainty, where these authors go in and they actually study firms within the financial world that deliberately maximize the uncertainty of their employees, which is totally different, contrary to mainstream organizational theory. So I'm gonna have to skip this, I guess. Let me just go to the end, because I'm over time. So the processes constituting the financial crisis and the housing bubble are multiple, complex, and contradictory. And the causes of the crisis are fundamentally overdetermined. There's no single cause that satisfies all inquiries. I would argue that it's observer dependent, and it depends on the parameters of your investigation, what kind of study you're doing, etc. And it's arbitrary at one point. You decide A causes B causes C, and you're going to cut off at that one point. It's somewhat arbitrary. But the crisis cannot be reduced to the actions of isolated individuals. That means that the principle of methodological individualism and economic rationality is not the best way to explain it. It must be explained with reference to emergent entities and processes, such as profit-maximizing firms, for instance, embedded in other types of social relations. So it has to be an interdisciplinary effort. You have to talk about psychology, sociology, and I don't have time to go into it now, but the last suggestion I would want to make is that after reviewing some of the economic sociological literature, such as Becker in 2006, who wrote a book called Beyond the Market, and others, economic sociology has given itself the task of explaining how or why markets are efficient. Part of the argument they claim is that economists, according to the principles of economics itself, you can't get things like trust and cooperation, therefore markets aren't efficient. I think this should be abandoned. I think this is totally irrelevant. And I think instead we should focus on empirical research into the dynamic processes of actually existing markets, not hypothetical ones. So that's it.